So Asa and Bill are going to talk today about the agreements module and some of the basic functionality associated with it.
Thanks, Stuart. Thank you, Stuart. So yeah, we'll start with sort of high-level overview. You see at the top, you have the 3 separate tabs for dashboard, agreements, and grants. We're going to focus primarily on the agreements. If you've been through the grants or the dashboard at all, you'll see a lot of similarities, but there's certainly some aspects that are unique to the agreements. So if we go to the agreements tab to start, we can dive in on some of that functionality. The one thing to highlight as far as like what the user, why the user accesses the agreements tab versus the dashboard or grants for that matter. The dashboard is much more reserved for these are the things that are assigned to me that I'm working on. And then this agreements tab is going to be much more navigation within the universe of agreements that are either in progress, already active, or now expired or terminated and thus archived. So most of the functionality within this agreements tab is navigation, searching, as well as creating new agreements, which we'll focus on in a second. So the tabs just below that initial tab, you have the main agreements page, and then just touch on briefly, there's a help center. If you get stuck, there's sort of videos and help docs that can help a user sort of how do I navigate around? Where do I find how to do X, Y, Z? Most of this is just sort of in the moment. If you get stuck, you can take a quick key concepts video, things like that. The other piece there above is reports. We won't go into that in great detail, but there's pre-canned standard reports. There's some advanced reports that function somewhat like a pivot table, as well as some custom reports that will get generated. So that information, and one of the common themes throughout Huron is there's a lot more data pulled, and thus there's a lot more potential for reporting. So there's a lot of powerful tools on that front, but we're going to focus mostly today on sort of navigating throughout the agreements module itself. So if you go back to the agreements page, so like I said, most of this is going to be navigation and searching capability. If you look at the specific tabs here, you see a series of different tabs and then filters that you can use to find a particular agreement that you may be looking for, or maybe you need to search for past counterparties that we have entered into agreements with, past types of agreements, all of the different fields that you see listed there with ID, name, agreement type, et cetera, those are all, you can click on that drop down that says ID and you can filter on any of those types to basically build a search, a custom search to narrow in on a specific agreement that you may be trying to locate. And all of this is text-based search, as well as you can filter based on each agreement column that is listed on there to sort it alphabetically. To Garrett's question about the agreement types, we'll touch on that in a second. Once we get into the create agreement, we had the ability to use some of our existing types as well as build onto that for our current structure, but we'll touch on that in a moment. These other tabs on here are mostly just similar views with different categories. So for example, the unassigned queue is the next tab to focus on. And the important note there is, unlike the architecture in ResearchUVA, where some of the agreements are automatically assigned, some of them go into an unassigned queue, all of the agreements here will, once they get submitted, either by the field or OSP, depending on the agreement, more on that in a bit, will get dumped into this unassigned queue and basically need to get routed out to the appropriate negotiator or grants administrator that's going to be reviewing and negotiating this agreement. So this will be an important business process step that we're working on finalizing for how does the agreements that get put into this queue after they get submitted and requested, how do they get appropriately assigned to the individual that's going to work on the agreement. So the next tab, and I'm not going to go through all the filtering because it's all pretty much consistent throughout. You have new agreements and then as well as in progress agreements. These are all just basically the different statuses that the agreement has once it gets submitted. We have active, which is agreements that have been executed and activated in the system. And then there's a final category that's not showing on there for archived. There we go. So active versus archived. Archived roughly means either it's been terminated or expired or discarded. So they separate out those various categories for ease of searching, basically. And then the last column or tab in there is the evergreen section, which this is an interesting capability that we didn't have previously, where we can highlight particular terms and conditions that may outlast the expiration of the agreement itself. And it basically allows us to do some better tracking of terms and conditions in the agreement that we may need to keep track of longer term, such as a much longer confidentiality requirement. Previously in ResearchUVA, we didn't have a great way of tracking those types of agreements that may have unique terms and conditions, and this gives us the potential to do that, which is nice. The other navigation piece I want to highlight is just this global search bar that's at the top. That allows you to do basically a keyword search, where if you're searching for particular language that came up in either the record or the documents within the record, the global search in the top right button functions somewhat like a Google search, and also allows you to use kind of like Boolean logic, where if you need to do an and statement or an or statement where you're searching for particular terms or things that you know came up at some point in a past agreement, it allows you to do that search, and it'll highlight whether that's coming from a page or a document within the system. So it should give us some good navigation capabilities when we're searching for old agreements. Let me see if I saw one more question. Can evergreen agreement types be tracked in another agreement type, or is it exclusive? So the evergreen agreement is basically you trigger that status for any agreement type, no matter what it is. It's not agreement specific, and allows us to track that over time. Okay, so that's sort of the overall look and feel of the page. If we go to the create agreement button, I'm going to highlight just briefly what this looks like, talk about some of who's going to be doing this, and some of the agreement types that Gareth referenced earlier. We're not going to go through the entire piece for time purposes, but we'll get this started. So the first step would be to enter in the PI's name. And so that's going to pull from the normal universe of UVA employees that that will be able to be loaded in. And then if you scroll down, it's going to ask you a series of questions. The administrative contact, usually that's going to be the study staff or the PI that's submitting the request. It gives you the chance to either upload an agreement draft if you've been provided one, or a lot of times we're generating the draft internally. Provide a title for the project. And here after the title of the project, number 5, we get to the agreement type. So this is a key juncture in the routing process where we're going to make the user is going to make a decision on what type of agreement they want to request. So it's important to step back and look at this relative to our existing infrastructure in ResearchUVA, where that was a little bit more siloed between the ESPAR, the ENFA, and the EPRF. In this, what's nice is it's all of the different agreement types, both funded and non-funded, as well as outgoing subawards, all gets requested right here. So the important part to note is that it's all one-stop shop for requesting agreements. And the different way that we're structured here requires that we provide as much information to the user as possible to make sure that they are requesting the appropriate type of agreement here. So we tweaked some of the agreement type descriptions based on our experience with using the ENFA system, as well as sort of input from Huron on what other schools have done, and came up with this list, which, like I said, is comprehensive to all agreement types, both funded and non-funded. So any further questions on the agreement types piece, because this is really a key juncture, like I said, in the process, and this is going to then drive, similar to the ENFA system, this is going to drive a lot of the subsequent pages that get that add additional questions based on this agreement type. So we have a logic built in that's going to say, here's, you've requested confidentiality agreement, so we can pull that agreement type, and then go down. It's going to ask for some additional questions on a description of the project, additional supporting documents. You can upload any other documents that are appropriate. We have a gating question to make sure that this isn't something that should really actually be routed through procurement. And then if you click the continue button to move forward, just so we can show what the next steps will look like. So this will then take you to the rest of the smart pages that are going to gather all of the information that the negotiator or grants administrator needs to review and negotiate the agreement. So I'm not going to walk through all of these questions because it's a fair amount of information that we're requesting, but the key takeaway points are that this is some of these questions are agreement specific relative to whether it's a non-funded agreement or a funded agreement. Some of them are specific to the actual agreement type that you selected, so that the specialist that receives it is able to review and execute the contract appropriately. So the user would then go through, answer all of these questions. There's validation requirements. So if the information that we need is not submitted or isn't submitted correctly, then it will give them an error and make them complete that. They're going to go through and complete all of those, and then it'll get routed to that unassigned queue that we showed you earlier. A question about multiple parties. In the general information page, I believe there's a possible additional counterparties down at the bottom. So additional counterparties, you're going to just add each of those additional counterparties in there, yeah. So yeah, we certainly can accommodate multiple parties within the agreement. As well as it's important to note that we have a process in place for if it's a new sponsor and we don't have their information in the record, that if you look up at the top, there's a new counterparty name, and there's a process to get them loaded into the table of sponsors. Okay, so at this point, I think we can back out of this. The user would then submit all of these questions, route route the agreement, and then it will land in that pre-submission stage. And then at that point, it basically gets, the user gets this view. Asa, do you want to walk through, since this view is basically the next steps of the actual negotiation of the agreement, you want to walk through these pieces and follow it through essentially to completion?
Sure, and actually the fact that we left out so much information is probably an opportunity to show some additional pieces of that workflow. So like Bill said, this is the page that you land on after you finish filling out all of those forms, the pre-submission phase. So once you are satisfied that it's complete, you would submit it to the workflow. You're going to get a bunch of validation errors because it's not complete. So probably I'll just go to one that exists already that was filled out completely. So let's see.
Hey, Asa, just a time check. We probably have about 15 minutes of content that we need to get through. So
sure,
if we can wrap up in about 8 minutes, that would be terrific.
I can definitely do that. Let's see. I'm looking for one that's active. Okay, so seems like a good one. So that's terminated actually. Okay, here we go. So once the agreement is submitted and it has been cleared that all of the necessary information has been filled in correctly, it will go to the unassigned status, which will then be assigned according to business processes that will determine based on portfolio, and there will be some sort of essentially an algorithm that determines who it gets assigned to. From there, it could potentially require additional clarification back to the office, the PI or the administrator that submitted it, and then it will be assigned and it will be under review. During the course of review, I'll just run through very quickly all of the different actions that the negotiator can take, which are mostly located over here on this left side. One thing you can do is assign it to a different negotiator who, for whatever reason, it should be assigned to. One of the features in Huron that we're very excited about is ancillary reviews, which is something that can allow the workflow to continue while a separate review is underway. This is something that we could potentially use for export controls, IRB waivers from the dean's office, different things like that. Basically what it does is it's a transparent way to track reviews in the system. And we've talked about this functionality a little bit in previous demonstrations. Another thing that's helpful is manage access, which is to say that for this specific agreement, you can give permission to different users who have access to ResearchUVA Powered by Huron, and you can give them different levels of access to the agreement. So if you have administrators or PIs that under, in ResearchUVA, if they were having difficulties getting access to a certain record, it's now very straightforward to be able to do that through the system. You can email a copy of the agreement through the system. You can send a message directly to the owner, the PI who submitted the agreement. And then a lot of the negotiation is going to be captured through this log correspondence. This is kind of a way to formally capture different messages that go through that go along during the course of negotiation. This could be anything from exchange drafts to specific comments on something that may have happened on a phone call. You can upload supporting documents, which may have an impact on updating the version of the agreement. One thing that Huron does is it will show each consecutive version of the agreement, so you can go through and see changes. And actually, one thing I won't go through now in the interest of time, but you can actually generate comparisons between those agreements. Let's see. We will have certain approved templates uploaded. So depending on the agreement type, you will be able to select from a bank of templates, which is not populated here, but it will automatically generate certain templates based on information that has been included in the submission paperwork. And then another thing that is that's exciting here is the manage relationships function, which is that you can take an existing agreement and you can establish a relationship between that agreement, other agreements. So for example, a confidentiality agreement that is essentially tied to a clinical trial agreement, you can show that there's actually a formal relationship between those two documents. You can also have relationships between a funding proposal and a funded agreement, for example, a funding proposal and a confidentiality agreement. There's really no limit as long as there is a formal record in the system. You can have a relationship between those two. Looking at the specific things that you can track here, as you can see, this is just correspondence that's been logged requesting a relatedness review. That's something that could be managed in an answer review. You can show all of the different, this is the history, this is all of the changes to the form, this is correspondence, this is essentially everything that happens in the record. So as you can see, this is an extremely transparent system to see everything that goes on during the course of negotiations. Contacts, it's a quick, easy, straightforward way to look at everybody that is relevant to the negotiation, both internally and externally. Same with snapshots. This shows the status of the paperwork, and if there are any changes that are made, it will show that those changes have been made. Related projects, as I said, this is when you manage relationships. This shows the funding proposal or any other agreements or awards that are associated with it, and then supporting documents the same way that we use in ResearchUVA, supporting documents that are necessary to kind of understand the full picture of the record. So I know that I kind of rushed that. This second part of the presentation, but if anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out. How is response time exceeded used? I'm not sure I see where that is. Yeah, which were you referring to?
I think it showed up in the correspondence view.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. So yes, that's actually a great question. So one of the things that's very cool about log correspondence is that it doesn't just disappear into a black hole. You can say I spoke to so and so and ask them to get me a certain piece of paperwork, and then you can actually make a due date for it. So that can be a due date to follow up. That can be a due date that we need to get some sort of interim notification to an outside office. Basically, log correspondence is a multifaceted function that allows you to track any number of different tasks that can go on. So it can be something as simple as had a phone call with the sponsor and discuss the following items, in which case you could just include it in notes. Or it can be spoke to the PI and he asked me to follow up with him in 2 weeks, in which case I can log that as a due date and not have anything slip through the cracks. So this is not only an extremely transparent system, but it's also very helpful for that sort of day-to-day activity that when everybody has a pretty high volume can kind of fall to the bottom of your queue without reminders like this. Thank you for asking that.
All right, thank you, Bill and Asa, for that rapid fire presentation on the agreements module. I think that one of the take-homes for me, even though I'm familiar with the system, is that it's very powerful. It collects a lot of information. Asa emphasized the transparency, and that's in fact, Ram and I were just talking about that before we got into the budget discussion. He specifically asked about PIs being able to go into the system and understand where something is and the status and what's been happening with it. So it's going to be extremely, that visibility of information is going to be a really powerful component of the system. All right, thanks very much. If you have additional questions, please put them in the chat and we'll do some follow-up to make sure they get answered.